Section 9.4, quantitative tightening. Now, in terms of this topic, QE is definitely more important than QT in terms of the final exam, in terms of what you need to know. So certainly focus on QE, what it is, how it's implemented, and the intended effects of QE. That is, how it affects financial markets, both domestic and foreign financial markets, and how it affects the domestic economy. In terms of how it affects the domestic economy, it is ultimately going to shift the AD curve to the right. We don't know how far it's going to shift it to the right. It depends upon so many different factors, but it will shift it to the right to some extent. Then, of course, there are the channels through which QE affect the aggregate demand curve. So they're important to understand. Now, I've presented 4, so that's at least 4 that you should be armed with, I guess, going into the final exam. Things like depreciation of the exchange rate, reduction in long-term interest rates, increase in liquidity, things like that. It's also going to increase confidence in the economy as well. If people can see the central bank actively buying bonds, inflating asset prices, creating more liquidity, it's likely to give businesses and consumers both a little bit of a boost in terms of their confidence moving forward. They're likely to then respond to that by spending more. So definitely QE rather than QT. But at the same time, we do need to know a little bit about what QT is. We're going to keep it very simple in this topic and just say that it is the reversal of QE. So what I've got on this slide is the Federal Reserve's balance sheet as of September 22, 2022. And you can see that the overall size of the Federal Reserve's balance sheet is close to $8.8 trillion. Prior to QE, if you went back and had a look at the Fed Reserve's balance sheet prior to the implementation of QE, so pre-GFC around 2008, then this number here would be less than $1 trillion. Can't exactly remember how much it was, but it was sort of $500, $600, $700 billion from memory. But it's inflated to 8 trillion. So what that tells you is that roughly, if we assume that the size of the Federal Reserve's balance sheet prior to the GFC, which is the point at which QE really kicked off in the US, so prior to the GFC, if the balance sheet was roughly $781 billion, then they've added another $8 trillion worth of QE money and pushed that into financial markets, into the economy. It's interesting to note what that 8 trillion has been used to purchase. Around about 2.7 trillion was used to purchase mortgage-backed securities. As I've already mentioned, you don't have to know what they are. They're a big part of the global financial crisis story, a big part of the toxic asset story, the Wall Street story, around that 2008-2009 global financial crisis period. So they certainly purchased a lot of those mortgage-backed securities. Right here we can see a number, $314.792 billion. That's US Treasury bills. They're short-term securities, generally a year or less. And we know QE purchases longer-term securities, and in Australia we call those bonds, but in the US they call them notes and bonds. Notes, I think, go from about 1 year to 3 years in the US. Bonds are roughly 3 years and beyond. So what we call bonds, the Americans split up into notes and bonds, but they're effectively the same thing, just different names. They've purchased nearly $5 trillion worth of bonds. And so QT is all about balance sheet normalization. It's about reducing the number of assets which are on this balance sheet. Of course, when you do that as the central bank, when you start selling these assets back into the real economy, back into financial markets, what you're doing is you're returning these assets back into financial markets and you're taking cash out. And so the central bank would receive, when they sell these assets slowly over time under QT, they would receive that cash back and then destroy it. Now, of course, they're not destroying paper cash. It's electronic cash. But that money would just literally disappear. So this gives you a little bit of context in terms of the size of the US QE program over that period from roughly 2010 through to about 2021. Okay, there are two types. Now we've got a fairly good idea of what QT is, but there's two types of QT. The first is what is known as active QT. That involves the central bank actually selling bonds actively into the secondary market. So they're selling the bonds prior to their maturity date back into the bond market. And those words prior to the maturity date are important because that is the main contrast between active and passive QT. Of course, it does remove money from the economy, but active QT is ideal if you want to remove a lot of this money but very, very quickly. So you just take the bonds on your balance sheet, you sell them en masse back into the economy, and you can withdraw that money very, very quickly. Passive QT involves a similar process of selling bonds back into financial markets, but generally at a much slower pace. So think of active QT as very fast QT and passive QT as very slow QT. And that's generally speaking the difference between the two, the speed at which the bonds are sold back into the market. So under passive QT, what happens is the central bank allows those bonds to roll off the balance sheet. That is, they allow the bonds to mature. So they would be holding bonds, billions of dollars, well, trillions of dollars worth of bonds of different durations. And so you could imagine if you are holding trillions of dollars worth of bonds, every month you would have probably hundreds of millions, if not a couple billions, tens of billions of dollars worth of bonds maturing, just naturally maturing. Because what you did under QE is you bought bonds which have had different maturity dates. Some of those bonds that you bought as the central bank would have had a maturity date 6 months into the future. Others would have had maturity dates, say 7, 10 years into the future. They would have been more newly issued bonds. So these bonds will be month by month, they'll be naturally maturing. And so when the central bank is holding bonds like this, under passive QT, they just wait for the bonds to naturally mature. Now, at the maturity date, the government then needs to pay the face value of the bond to the central bank. So that's just a money transfer. But the question then becomes, well, where does the government get the money from to pay the face value of the maturing bond that the central bank is holding to the central bank? Where do they get that money from? Well, don't say out of tax revenue, because remember, we're probably in a recession, or we're probably recovering from a recession under QT, and chances are the government budget balance would be in deficit. So there's no tax revenue left over after government spending has taken place. Now, that's not a rule. I'm just saying that's the most likely situation, that the government budget is in deficit. So there isn't a government budget surplus to pay back these maturing bonds, so where's the government get the money from? As I've got written there, they will have to issue new bonds to raise the money to then make those payments to the central bank. And so what's actually happening is money is being removed from the economy. It's just that the money is being loaned to the government through the issue of new bonds, and the government is then using that money to pay the central bank when those maturing bonds mature. So money is leaving the economy. But in effect, what you're doing is you are replacing the bonds that are maturing, that are being held by the central bank, with newly issued bonds that the government issues to raise the money to pay out those maturing bonds. So generally speaking, QT will have the opposite effects of QE. Asset prices will fall, the exchange rate will appreciate, long-term interest rates will rise, confidence may weaken a little, all of those opposite effects. But the main difference is between active and passive QT. And as I've said, that just involves the speed at which QT is implemented. And of course, under active QT, the pace of the sale of the bonds could actually be stretched out so that the pace of the sale approaches the pace of sale under passive QT. But certainly active QT does give the central bank the ability to sell a lot of bonds in a short period of time, because they don't, under that sort of approach to QT, the central bank doesn't have to wait for those bonds to mature. They can just sell them back into financial markets at any time they like. Now, one final thing to remember about QT. QT programs are likely to cost the central bank money, and has been estimated that Australia's QE program during 2020-2021 will cost the central bank roughly $40 to $50 to $60 billion. So why is that the case? And who ultimately pays that money? Well, ultimately, it's likely to be Australian taxpayers that pay that money. But where does the loss come from? The loss comes from the fact that under QE, the central bank is printing money and driving bond prices up. So generally speaking, they're paying very high prices for these bonds. Under QT, they're now selling bonds, and bond prices are likely to start falling. So the central bank will be, generally speaking, buying bonds at high prices and pushing prices higher, and selling those same bonds at lower prices as prices are falling. So the loss comes from the fact that the central bank is likely to be buying bonds at very high prices, but selling them at lower prices. But that's just an additional price we pay to use the policy tool QE to try to move the economy out of recession and back to full employment.